Yogah Karmasu Kaushalam.
Namaskar and good afternoon to all of you. I am Dr. Sunny Wadhwaniya. I work as Head of Operations at Institute of Defence Studies and Research, Gujarat University. I would like to thank UGC HRTC, Gujarat University, Ahmedabad for organizing the third online refresher course in Commerce and Management and for giving me an opportunity to be a part of this program. Special thanks to Professor Dr. Jagdish Joshiji, Director, Gujarat University, Dr. Mamta Brahmbhatt, and Dr. Neelam Panchal, coordinators for the third online refresher course in Commerce and Management. Friends, today in this session, the next 60 minutes, we will be discussing about the public policy management, perspectives, issues, and strategies. Friends, in today's time, where globalization is the buzzword in our life, public policy and management of public policy has become an important part, not only for the government, but also for the stakeholders. When I am saying stakeholders, it also includes us as the citizens, because we have been part of public policy directly or indirectly in our everyday life. We would be learning about the basics of public policy. Then we will be discussing about what is the process of public policy management, what are the challenges of public policy, and then what are the strategies for effective public policy management. So I would like to start with objectives and learning outcomes of the module. So once we complete this module, we will be able to understand, number one, the basic of public policy, policy process, structures in its structures, component, parts, its various dynamics. And as I've already mentioned before, the challenges, issues in public policy management, and also the strategies for effective public policy management. Now, let us start with the basic. Before going into the public policy, before going into the public policy management, it is very, very important for us to understand the meaning of policy. Policy शब्द का अर्थ समझना हमारे लिए बहुत जरूरी है. Before we understand public policy and before we understand the public policy management. So what is essentially a policy? Policy का मतलब क्या है? Policy मतलब नीति. उसको हम in Hindi we say it as niti, and public policy is lok niti. The policy which is centered around public, which is focusing on the public welfare, is public policy. Now, when we say policy, a policy can be of different kinds. It can be a statement, it can be a law, it can be an ordinance. So there are different forms of policy which we'll be discussing later, at a later stage in this module. So when we talk about public policy, we are focusing on lok niti. Lok niti means policy which is citizen-centric, policy which is focusing on the larger interest of public welfare. So that is public policy. Now, from the government perspective, if we want to understand public policy from a government perspective, we can say that it's an action to address specific challenge. Now, friends, understand this, that any policy, when any policy is prepared, the basic objective of any policy is to address a specific challenge. If there is no challenge, if there is no problem, the existence of the policy is difficult. Policy cannot exist without a problem. And it's always an action to address a specific challenge. I'm trying to make you understand from the government perspective, from the governance perspective. So, when there is a specific problem, when there is a specific challenge, there is a policy to address the challenge. A simple example, which we all encounter in our day-to-day life, is while we travel from our home to our workplace, we usually stop at signals, red signals. And when the signal is red, it is an indication that you have to stop your vehicle. If you don't stop that vehicle, you probably would meet with an accident. So, this action on stopping on a public signal is a solution to address a specific challenge, which is to reduce the number of accidents, to reduce the traffic issues in the city or in that particular area. And that action which the government mandates us as a stakeholder is to drive slow and carefully and to stop on public signals wherever it is necessary in order to avoid this issue of congestion, the traffic congestion. That's one simple example. That's one simple example. The other simple example is the speed breakers, which we encounter in our day-to-day life. Now, that is also an action to address a specific challenge of reducing the number of accidents by reducing the speed of the vehicles. Therefore, there are the speed breakers on the road. These are the very, very common examples which I can think of at this moment. So, it's an action. And this action is because we want to address a specific challenge. Now, the other perspective for this is what the government chooses to do or not to do about the problem. Sorry. So it's not only about the action, but it's also about the inaction. So when I say this, that it's also about inaction, which means that if the government chooses to address a specific challenge by a means of action, and if the government chooses to not to address a specific challenge, it's also an indication of a policy. So what the government chooses to do or not to do about the problem, that's a perspective from the government side, from the governance perspective. So that is essentially what a public policy means. So as I have already discussed earlier, there are various forms of policy, right? And there are various forms of public policy. And these forms can be in forms of a constitutional provisions, जिसको हम संवैधानिक प्रावधान कहते हैं, laws, कानून, regulations, नियम जिसको हम कहते हैं, and policies are revealed through texts, practices, symbols, and discourses that define and deliver values, including goods and services, as well as regulations, income status, and other positively or negatively valued attributes. So these are the different forms of policies, and these policies can be found in constitutional provisions, laws, and regulations. Coming to some of the most important definition in today's time about public policy. Just because we are learning the basics of public policy, it becomes very important for us to understand few definitions in practice. For example, Clerk and Caution et al. Refers public policy as the actions of the government and the intentions that determine those actions. So they're basically talking about two important things in the definition. One is the action and the other is the intention. So it's not just the action which defines policy, but also the intentions of the government which defines the public policy. Please recollect the earlier example which we were just discussing, which is about what the government intends to do or not to do. So not to do is the intention of the government. So when we talk about public policy from a government perspective, it is the action as well as intention of the government. Similarly, there are other definitions by various authors. We would just have a glimpse of this and go forward. Again, public policy consists of political decisions for implementing programs to achieve societal goals. In order to achieve societal goals, let's say, for example, poverty reduction, women empowerment, gender equality, economic equality, income equality, environment sustainability. These are all the societal goals in today's time. Digital equality. These are all the societal goals in today's time. So, in order to achieve these goals, there has to be a political decisions. And these political decisions are based on specific policies. And before policy and decisions come, there is a political will to address a particular challenge. And then there is a decision. I've given you several examples of societal goals and the specific challenges which exist in the society. One of the most pertinent in today's time is the economic inequality in the society, gender inequality in the society, women empowerment, digital inequality in the society, etc., etc. These are the various societal goals I can think of at this point of time. So, in order to achieve those societal goals, it is very important to have political decisions based on specific policy. And sometimes these decisions are also termed as policies. For example, we have all been through an unprecedented phase of COVID-19 pandemic lockdown. Even now, again, there are, we have been reading a lot about the fourth wave. But what is the most important policy, the most important decision which the government immediately took after getting after assessing the possibility of fourth wave, which is that they made the facial masks compulsory for all of us. So what is that? That's a political decision. And sometimes that decision is termed as a policy. Now that becomes a policy. We all have experienced lockdown times, where we were told to remain inside our homes from morning 10 to evening 6, and then there is 1 hour of liberty which is given to all of us, and then people can come out and take their regular groceries. So that decision is a policy decision, which is again addressing a specific challenge of a pandemic at that point of time, right? Peter says, stated most simply, public policy is the sum of government activities, whether acting directly or through the agents, as it has an influence on life of the citizens. We have already discussed earlier that the most important, the most important part, the most important characteristic of public policy is that it impacts the life of the citizen. It impacts the life of the citizen. And why does it impact the life of the citizen? Because it is targeted towards the larger public good, the larger public interest. Now, a public policy, there is also this interesting way of understanding public policy, which is the sum of all government activities. All the government activities intended to address a specific challenge. In a way, every step of the government, or every step of every step targeted towards addressing a specific challenge is a policy. And we see the influence of public policy in our life, in our day-to-day life. And we are all surrounded by public policies. So when you sum all of this, the sum of all the government activities is a public policy, whether acting directly or through their agents. And of course, it has an influence on us. It has an influence on life of the citizens. Now, who are the players in public policy? They are voters, all of us, politicians, interest groups, media, experts, civil servants, administration, academics, bureaucrats, judiciary, courts, researchers, all of us are players in public policy. It is not only government, but it is all of us. So, for example, interest group. Interest groups are a group of those people who want, who would try to pursue or influence the government for taking us specific decisions. The farmers' protest, for example, interest groups. Some of the most historical judgments in the history of the Indian judiciary, which the influence of which we are still experiencing the influence of those judgments. So the courts and the judiciary become a part of public policy, likewise by giving some historical judgments. Politicians, think tanks, researchers, some of the public policies can also be influenced by the research reasons. So the COVID-19 vaccine, how does the COVID-19 vaccine came into existence? Through various kind of researches, scientific researches. The application of the scientific researches are now influencing us in our day-to-day life in form of COVID-19 vaccines. So this is how research plays an important role in public policy. That's why all of this are equal players in determining the influence of public policy. Civil servants, media, etc., administrations, all of these are different players. Let us quickly look at what are the types of public policy. There are four major types of public policy. The first is substantive, and these policies are concerned with general welfare and development of the society. And that's why they are known as the most important public policies. They are policies which are of larger and general welfare. For example, economic policies. So those policies are targeting towards the general welfare of the people. Regulatory policies, they are concerned with the regulation of trade, business, and public utilities, largely an economic angle, that is a regulatory type of public policy. Manrega, substantive public policy. But Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, substantive public policy, targeting towards the general welfare and development of the society. Distributive, they are meant for specific segments of the society. It can be the area of grants of goods, public welfare, health services, those sections which are termed as marginalized sections in the society, in order to bring them into, in order to streamline them, bring them into the mainstream, distributive policies are used. And then there is a redistributive policies. So how do we summarize it? Now we have learned the basics of public policy. To summarize it, it can be said that a statement by government of what it intends to do, such as law, regulation, ruling, decision, order, or combination of this. The lack of such statements may also be implicit statement of a policy not to do something. As we have already discussed, that what the government intends to do and not to do, it is also a policy statement. Government does public policies in form of law, regulations, ruling, decisions, or combinations of this, right? So that is public policy from a governance perspective. Now coming to the public policy management process. We have so far learned about the basics of policy, the types of policy, who are the players in public policy. Now we will be learning about, we will be discussing the public policy management process. Now the term itself indicates that we are managing the public policy. And to manage this public policy, there are different activities and different process. We will be going to understand this different process when we talk about public policy management process. So public policy management process includes a range of activities in number of different jurisdictions, including local and state government. It includes the following activities like agenda setting, policy formulation, decision making, policy implementation, and policy evaluation. Now we will be discussing all this activities in detail, but to give you a glimpse of what public policy management looks like, it starts from setting an agenda. Why do you set an agenda? You set an agenda because you know that there is a specific challenge and you know that you have to address that specific challenge. And that specific challenge can only be addressed by setting a particular agenda, right? Once you are done with the agenda, you work towards formulation of a particular policy to achieve that agenda. Once you form a policy, you have various alternatives in front of you, and you have to take the decision of implementing one of those alternatives which suits best to address the specific challenge. And then you implement that policy. The implementation also is a very mechanical process, right? And once you implement that, you come to the last stage of public policy management process, which is the policy evaluation, wherein you evaluate your policy in order to understand that you started with an objective, whether that policy is satisfying that particular objective or not. whether that policy is fulfilling the purpose of a larger public welfare, right? So, as I've already discussed earlier, we'll be looking at the strategies and issues also of public policy management process. But before this, friends, I would urge you that you understand in detail about the basics of public policy. Unless you don't understand the basics of public policy, understanding public policy management process will be a little difficult, right? I'll be giving my email ID and contact address. You can, of course, connect to me on email. I would be happy to answer all your queries after the session. So what does a public management process look like? We call this as the policy cycle, right? Because it's a circular process. So it starts with agenda setting. As I've already briefed you earlier, that agenda setting is all about identifying the emerging issues. You need public policy for what reason, right? What are those issues at hand which needs a policy, right? So what you do is you identify those issues first. The second stage involves the formulation. The formulation of policy, wherein you also look at the impact assessment. Now you have a problem at hand. But what is the impact of that problem on the citizens or on the beneficiary, right? Or on the target group? You identify the impact. You look at the impact of that problem. And then once you know that this is the impact, whether it's an adverse impact, if it is having an adverse impact on the target group, what you do is you form the policy. Again, I would like to come back to the example of COVID-19 pandemic. So never ever we have heard about this term lockdown. All of us were new to this. Social distancing, right? We were all new to this, but these terms are the results of impact assessment, where how is COVID-19 impacting an individual and how to reduce that adverse impact on the individual, which is physical distancing, social distancing, wearing of masks, lockdowns in worst cases. So these are all the policies after impact assessment. So these are the policies which were formed after the impact assessment. And then comes the adoption stage. Okay, you have framed the policy, you have made the policy. Now you have to see that whether this policy needs any change or not. Okay, you have to see that this policy needs any improvements or not. If it does require any improvement, you have to intervene the policy, amend the policy, and that happens at the adoption stage, right? And also from the policy perspective, you also support and advise to the regulatory bodies, which means the government, people who are responsible for implementing the policy. So that also happens at this stage. And then comes the implementation. You implement the policy, and then comes the evaluation. How effective and efficient your policy is. That is done at this stage, right? And then comes the support and maintenance. All policies are subject to change. Not all policies are permanent policies. They're all subject to change. They're all temporary in nature and dynamic in nature. So when it is temporary and dynamic in nature, it is very obvious that there can be a possibility The policy can result into crisis. And if the policy results into crisis, what is happening in Sri Lanka, we all know. And that crisis is a result of the worst policy making by the government. So there also has to be a strategy, which we will maybe learn at a later stage in the same module, about how to respond to crisis in case there are policy crises, in case the policy is not successful enough in addressing the specific challenges, right? Now, let's look at all the stages in detail, one by one. So number one stage is agenda setting. So what do you do? We all know what an agenda is. Okay, we have all come across these terms. So what do we do in agenda setting? So remember, friends, all of this which we are discussing right now is a part of public policy management process. Okay, in the first stage, a problem or challenge that impacts the public or stakeholders is initially identified, right? That is initially identified and put forward by interested parties, both inside and outside the government. So when I'm saying inside the government, it's the government itself, and when I'm saying outside the government, they are interest groups, pressure groups, right? Also, people who work on voluntary basis for the larger welfare of the society. So once, agenda setting is all about identifying a challenge. Here you not only identify a challenge, but you also take into account the impact of the challenge or problem on public at large. And along with agenda setting, along with identification of the problem, what you do is you also put forward the solutions, right, of that particular problem. So how is this process done? It's very interesting to understand how is this process done. So it has 4 stages. One is systematic agenda. All issues public officials feel are worth addressing. Okay, this includes all issues. There is no filter in this. All of the issues which they feel needs an immediate attention is included in systematic agenda. Institutional agenda. Institutional agenda is distilled from systematic agenda list. So there are a few agendas which are now filtered, and these issues are chosen as the ones policymakers should analyze and consider acting on. So this is essentially setting a direction in which the policymakers and the decision makers in the government should consider acting on. So this is actually the second important stage in agenda setting, where you are filtering out the real problems, and it is actually setting a direction for you to work on. Discretionary agenda. This list comes directly from lawmakers, not from the systematic and institutional agendas. Okay, and the last is decision agenda, the final list of issues that policymakers will consider for action. So first, what you did is you summarized all the problems. In the second stage, you have filtered problems which needs your critical attention. You have set the direction to work in the second stage, and in the third stage, finally, you again filter out and you have issues which really needs to work upon. That is a priority list, which is a decision agenda. It's a priority list of the government to work on a particular policy. All right. And this list can be considered as a political decision also, because it also includes the interest of a particular political party. What I meant is, before the election, they must have promised something to the people. And after the election, it's a time for them to repay, to work on those promises. So decision agenda is also about a political, the fulfilling the promises of a political party through a political decision. But all these decisions are addressing the larger welfare of the society, right? Then comes formation. How do you form the policy? This step involves development of policy options within the government, because of course, government is authorized to make the policy. And since the government is authorized to make the policy, it happens within the government. And this occurs after official narrow range of possible policy choices by excluding infeasible options. So once you have the list of problems, then you have the list of alternatives, how to solve that problems. And from that list of alternatives, you again filter it out, the best alternatives, which is addressing to that challenge. And this all happens within the government. In this step, different interested parties attempt to have their favored policy solutions rank high among the remaining options. This step often involves a period of intense debate. We have all noticed an intense debate in Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha on some policy issues. And these policy options, policy options are of course considered from outside the government, also from the interest group also. But the direction and the process of working on those policy decisions are done within the government, within the parties. And why is there an intense debate? Because everyone is interested everyone is interested and everyone is attempting to have their favored policy solution rank high among the remaining options, right? So therefore, it is a period of intense debate, okay? And that's how a policy is formed. And that's how a policy is formed. And then comes the decision making. In this step, the government leaders decide on a particular course of action. Once you have an intense debate and you have an output of the debate, then you decide how to implement that course of action. And ideally, it is the course that will address the problem for the most members of the public. So this is the decision making. This is what I was talking about when I mentioned about the political decision, right? The political will. So here comes the political decision and the political will. So it is the course that will best address the problem for the most members of the public, right? So this is the most critical and important stage while we talk about the policy formation. There are various examples I can list down of the effective policy decision making of the present government, which has actually solved a larger public interest, which has actually addressed a larger public challenge. Then comes the policy implementation stage. It is self-explanatory that what you do here is once you take the decision, once you decide on a particular decision, it's a time for you to implement the decision on the field. And how does this happen? In this step of the policy making process, government puts the chosen public policy options into effect. Remember, this stage can also invite controversies. It can also result into violence, right? Or it can also lead to this can also lead to a perception about the government, whether the government is doing good or the government is doing bad for the people. So policy implementation is like a two-edged sword for the government. It can also lead to victory. It can also lead to, people can praise the government for taking the decisions, and it can also be a disaster for the government. And there are many examples in the recent past where we have witnessed the opposition from the people on various policy options. So officials use the tool of public administration that impacts the distribution of the government goods and services to make the changes in how government tax the public. The changes should reflect the sentiments and values of the affected parties. So how it is done? Officials use the tool of public administration that impacts the distribution of government goods and services. So what do you mean by tools of public administration? For example, Gazette. Whatever instructions we used to get during the lockdown times, it used to be on the public Gazette, right? Which means that this is an order from the government, and you as a citizen are bound to follow that order. You have to follow this order. The night curfew timings, and essentially what does the government do is they communicate to people through various tools. The Gazette is one among them. Social media is one among them. But the government is trying to communicate to people about a particular policy implementation. All right. And it reflects the sentiments and values of affected parties. The fourth stage after policy implementation is the policy evaluation. Again, this is self-explanatory. Interested parties both within and without the government, outside the government, monitor the impact of policy and determine if it is achieving the intended goal. So you have implemented the policy, you also have to evaluate whether the policy is actually achieving the intended goal or not. Therefore, you evaluate. As I told you earlier, evaluation is a very mechanical process, and there are various methods for policy evaluation. Don't forget, all this is a part of public policy management process. And policy evaluation can lead to further changes in public policy done in light of the impact of the original policy. So after looking at the process of public policy management, also it is very important for us to understand the characteristics of public policy management process. Number one, it's a complex process. Why it is a complex process? Because many actors connected through communication and feedback are involved in the public policy management process. Many actors are, for example, we had also discussed about the various players. There are bureaucrats, there's a judiciary, there are interest groups, there are think tanks, researchers, politicians, scientists. All of them are involved in policy making, policy management process. And therefore, that makes it a very complex process. And that's the beauty of democracy. In a country like India, if you want to get involved in any of the public policy management process, you can also get involved. But there is a way to get involved by using a government machinery, right? So there are many public welfare non-government organizations which actually works for public policy management process. And likewise, there are many actors, and therefore it is a very complex process. When I'm saying process, related to the public management process, public policy management process, it's a dynamic process. Dynamic means it's a continuing activity for a sustenance within a structure. It requires continuous inputs of resource and motivation. It's not just a one-time process. It's not a process which will start at one point of time and end at one point of time. It's an ongoing process, irrespective of the governments, irrespective of the various players. It's a continuing activity. And because it's a continuing activity, it provides an opportunity for various actors to get involved. And that substantiates the basic values of democracy, right? Because it's a dynamic process, there is a need for continuous inputs of resources. Resources can be in form of money, it can be in any form, any resources. It can be human resource, it can be financial resource, right? So because it's a dynamic process, it requires a continuous inputs. Remember, dynamic is, what we mean by dynamic is it's a continuing activity. Policy making comprises various components. It is self-explanatory that the identity of these substructures and the degree of their involvement in policy making vary because of different issues, circumstances, and societal values. And because it's a complex process, it comprises of various components, and the degree of their involvement depends upon degree of their involvement in policy making is different because of different issues, circumstances, and societal values. Policy structure makes different contributions. This characteristic suggests that every substructure makes a different and sometimes a unique contribution to public policy. What sort of contribution substructures makes depend in the part of their formal or informal characteristics, which vary from society to society. Lays down major guidelines. Public policy in most cases lays down general directives rather than detailed instructions on the main lines of action to be followed. So once a policy is implemented, once a policy is formed, it lays down major guidelines in form of detailed instructions. And after main lines of actions have been decided on, detailed sub-policies that translates the general theory into more concrete terms are usually needed to execute it. So why is this characteristics most important? Because we had discussed in just now that there are various tools of public administration. Like social media is nowadays become a tool of public administration. How do you communicate through social media? You communicate through these major guidelines. And these guidelines are now becoming directions for people to act upon of what the government has decided on a particular issue. And it also involves detailed sub-policies that translate the general theory. General theory, when I am saying general theory, I means overall policy into a more concrete term. So you're breaking the overall policy into minute policy pieces, and those minute policy pieces are then meant to be implemented by the stakeholders. Results in actions. Decision making can result in action in changes in the decision making itself, or both or neither. So when we talk about result in action, so an action is a result of decision making. Decision making can result in action, in changes in the decision making itself, or both or neither. The policies of most socially significant decision making, such as the most public policy making, intended to result in action. Of course, the whole exercise, it's a very mechanical exercise. And why is this exercise done? This exercise are done with an objective to result in action. And once there is an action, you will be able to judge whether the policy is actually fulfilling the objectives or not, whether it is actually addressing a specific challenge or not. Any challenge cannot be addressed because when there is a lack of action. So a public policy management process also results in action. Also, policies directed at the policy making apparatus itself, such as efficiency drives in the government, are action oriented. So it's not only about an action, or you're not only talking about an action on the stakeholders, you're also talking about an action on the policymakers also, right? Because efficiency is one of the most important thing here. If you're not able to efficiently and effectively deliver a policy through your action, the whole exercise could be in vain. Therefore, it is also important that there can be policies which are directed at the policy making apparatus itself in order to maintain that efficiency. For example, the independent institutions in our country, the Supreme Court of India, Honorable Supreme Court of India, those are independent institutions. You cannot influence those institutions. They are an ideal example of a policy making apparatus. So if the government is making a policy, there has to be an independent institution evaluating the process of making that policy, evaluating the efficiency and effectiveness of the policy. Human rights commissions, they are all a part of independent, they're all autonomous independent institutions. And their role is to direct policy making to the policy making apparatus itself, so that there is an efficiency while policy is implemented, while an action is taken. Directed at the future. Policy making is directed at the future. This is one of the most important characteristics, since it introduces the ever-present element of uncertainty and doubtful prediction that establish the basic tone of nearly all policy making. Now you see, no matter whatever process you follow, no matter how mechanical your exercise is, policy making management exercise is, there is always an uncertainty and doubtful prediction. There is always uncertainty whether this particular policy will work or not. We have seen various examples of policy failures in the past, scientific and otherwise also. So this is an inherent characteristic of public policy management. It is directed at the future. And because it is directed at the future, there is always this presence of these elements of uncertainty and doubtful prediction. So these are all the characteristics of public policy management process. Now let's discuss some of the issues. Since the module is focusing on the public policy management issues and strategies, we will see what are some of the issues in public policy management. The first issue is a lack of emphasis on prevention. A primary function of government is to reduce risks faced by the society. The idea of early action to prevent or mitigate harm has been gaining traction, but progress has been slow. So what happens is that whenever the government is trying to formulate a policy, that policy has to be more focused on prevention rather than just debates. And in fact, that's the primary function of the government, to reduce the risk faced by the society. So what will happen is the vulnerable population in the society, the primary function of the policy is to reduce the adverse impact of any issues on the vulnerable population of the society. So, the focus of the policy has to be more on prevention, right? It should prevent, when we say that the policy is addressing a challenge. So when a policy is addressing a challenge, it should prevent that problem. It should see that the problem is not affecting the stakeholders on a permanent basis. The solution which a policy is providing to address a specific challenge has to be sustainable. Has to be sustainable. And why it is necessary? Because only then you will be able to prevent the adverse impacts. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, COVID-19 vaccine, there can be termed as I'm not sure, can be termed as a sustainable solution, because that is in a way mitigating the risk on a vulnerable population of the society. So that is targeting on prevention, not on just debates, or not on just political gains or political brownie points for any particular political party. So, but now, some of the policies like governments around the world, no, in one way or another, they lack the emphasis on prevention. It's more of a show off about fulfilling their promises. And the solutions which they are offering for a particular problem is not sustainable. So therefore, this is the first important issue, which is the lack of emphasis on prevention. One reason is that preventive discourses on domestic policy tends to dominate only limited areas. You are only focusing on limited areas, for example, crime, unemployment, worklessness, family problems, for example, but you should also address the interrelated areas with interrelated areas which are not being addressed by any particular policy. For example, mental health. Until recently, mental health was just not considered as an area of importance, right? But now, when you talk about crime, when you talk about family problems, mental health is again a related area with crime. When you talk about unemployment, education and literacy, awareness of education and awareness of literacy is again a related area with unemployment. And when you talk about literacy, rural areas and urban areas, the disparity existing between rural areas and urban areas is again a related area with unemployment. So you just not have to target on employment. You have to also target on issues which which are indirectly related to that particular areas. Okay. With prevention, action is usually long-term. As I've already mentioned, it is sustainable long-term, more complex to control, less visible, harder to measure, and more likely to involve controversial choices. You have to be ready to face controversies. Any government has to be ready to face controversies when you do it on a sustainable basis. Short-termism in decision making. There is a related but distinct issue of short-termism. What do you mean by short-termism? Policymakers usually make decisions in a complex environment with limited time for reflection. In order to gain your political brownie points, what you do is you implement the decision without taking a much more informed, you implement a policy without taking an informed decision, and decision which is backed by research, the decision which is backed by data. So that is short-termism. And that short-termism will actually give rise to more complex situation, because you haven't researched more before implementing a policy. Governments wants to demonstrate the progress quickly and are usually rewarded for spending public funds on today's visible problems rather than reducing future risk. Okay, you made the policy, right? You have demonstrated your progress. Okay, you have spent your public funds, public money. But an important question a policy maker should ask is that the policy which is implemented by spending the public money is sustainable or not? Is it reducing a future risk or not? Is it actually working on the problems of the vulnerable population of the society or not? So all these questions are missing when we talk about short-termism decision making, right? It's a symbolic policies, just for symbol. It won't have any impact on the challenge or the problem at hand. Short-termism and symbolic policies will be the right approach for a particular situation, but the good government can simply be about better firefighting. It needs to learn to prevent fires. It's not about just learning about how to fight with the fire, but you should also know how to prevent the fire. You should also know how to prevent the problems. Social mobility, poverty, public health, climate change, housing, social care, and regional disparities are long-term challenges which have to be addressed across parliaments. So all these challenges have been in existence from the time immemorial. But so far, we have not been able to find a sustainable solution for all this problem. In fact, what we do is, what our policy intend to do is accelerate the problem rather than reducing the risk of the problem. However, there have been some good works in few countries, especially with related to climate change and public health. But why is it not sustainable? That's the most important question. So coming to the last part, which is strategies for effective public policy management. First is define where you are going. The most important step in public policy management is first decide your goals. Be specific with your goals, right? And decide how you are going to get there. Okay? So, this is a policy pyramid. This is known as a policy pyramid. I've referred More 1995, strategic management governance, government Howard business process. It says that your goal, the goal which you are deciding, has to be doable, supportable, and technically correct. Unless your goals are not meeting these criteria, it will be very difficult for you to address that particular goal. So how you are going to get there, which means that your goal has to support these three most important criteria, which is technically correct, doable, and support. The goal, the objective, the policy intends to achieve is at the center. To achieve these objectives, there are three conditions: technically correct, doable, and supportive, and monitor the progress. Monitoring your program allows the policymakers to assess if the policy is on track and if there is a need for any change. The last is, I think, adjust as needed. Policy and programs need to adjust as circumstances. Policies and programs need to adjust as circumstances as it evolves. In public policy, one of the challenges is the lack of time and space to think about the adoption. You don't have to lose the flexibility of adopting the changes wherever it is necessary. When you become rigid in adopting the changes, which means your policy will die on that spot, on that moment when you deny of adopting the changes. So therefore, you have to, policy has to be of a nature which is adjustable wherever it is needed, right? So that's all from my end. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. You can get in touch with me on email. My email ID is, please note down my email ID. My email ID is sunny.cug@gmail.com. I would be happy to answer your queries. And once again, thank you so much and have a good day.